All right, everyone. Well, it's time to continue in our series, Light and Life. Our study of First John will be in First John chapter 3, in John's Gospel chapter 15 today. So if you want to turn or swipe over that direction, that'd be great. As you're doing that, let me give you an update on how the church is doing financially during these times. First, let me offer a word of gratitude to those of you that have continued to give during this time of distance and even this time of uncertainty. Our giving has gone down somewhat over the last 2 weeks, as you might expect, and it's got me thinking a little bit about the Torah, specifically the book of Leviticus. Now, that's not something I say very often, that I'm thinking about the book of Leviticus, but in this case I have been. The Torah, you may remember the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and it's really focused on the story of the creation of God's people, from Abraham in Genesis all the way through the journey of the Hebrew people and Moses up to the edge of the Promised Land in Deuteronomy. And a lot of what's happening there is the creation of community, the creation of what it means to be God's people in the world. In Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, and Leviticus 23-22, they institute a practice in their community where they ask those who are planting and growing their fields to, when the time for harvest comes, that they leave the edges of their fields unharvested. The idea is that those in need can walk through their neighbors' fields without fear, without shame even, to grab a little bit of food as they need for their family. The idea is that in the midst of harvest, in the midst of plenty, we're always leaving room for those in need. And so my request for you, my ask for you this morning, is that you take a look at your own field. For some of us, the impact of this pandemic financially is already being felt. There's concerns around job loss or hours being cut back. Those who are owning businesses are worried about meeting payroll in the days ahead. Some of us, our fields are looking a lot different than they did a few days ago. Others of us, however, haven't been impacted financially by the virus yet. And so my encouragement would be, if you're in a place where things continue to look good financially, your field is in good shape, that you would consider increasing your giving at this time in order to sort of cover the difference, to help out those who are in need. Not only does it allow some margin for people to maybe push pause on their giving in their time of need in their business or in their family, but it allows others to make up the difference. Not only so that the church can meet its obligations, we think it's important to pay our mortgage and pay our staff, but also so that we can continue to have resources to meet financial and physical needs in our community. So if you'd be willing to do that, I would appreciate it. There's 3 ways that you can give to us in this time of distance. The first is by mail. You'll see our address on the screen. You can write us a check and drop it in the mail. We'll make sure it gets to the right place. The second is through your bank's online bill pay. You can log in online at a safe distance, put in the church's information, and have the bank send that money to us by mail. No cost to you, no cost to us. It's a great way to do it. And finally, you can give online. You can go to our website. You'll see that there's a link at the top to give, and you'll find an online secure giving portal. You can give by credit card or by bank draft. Bank draft is a great option as it's got real low cost both to the church and no cost to you. And so that's a great way to make sure that the vast majority of your money is going straight to the church. Again, thank you to those of you who are giving, those of you who are able to meet the needs both in our church and in our community. We're grateful. Now, with that in mind, let's turn over to 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 11. So we'll be in 1 John 11 through 24 today, the second half. That'll take us all the way through the end of chapter 3. And this is a big moment in the letter of 1 John, because we shift from the primary or the first metaphor of light to the second metaphor, the second theme, I should say, of love. And so we'll see that transition begin to take place. Now, as we do that, as we kind of get ready to dive in, let's just pick up a couple of key background elements, right? So we've talked about before how this letter is likely from a pastor to a set of churches that have gone through some conflict. They've had people in the community that have since departed, and they're trying to make sense of what that means and how that's impacting them. One of the key themes of the book of First John, and really for many of us, kind of the theme of our faith, is this desire and this journey of attempting to be faithful. What does it mean for us to be people of faith, but to be faithful to Christ, faithful to one another? That's an overarching and underwriting theme throughout the letter. And so today, one of the things that will bubble up to the surface is this theme or this topic of reassurance, that the pastor, the elder here, is seeking to reassure his church, to reassure those who remain in the community as those that they know, those that they love, have departed. So he's been fairly critical of those people that have departed up until now, and really begins to shift his focus from kind of making the case that those people were in the wrong to now reassuring those that have been faithful or remained behind. Now, you may have noticed, we've talked a little bit about this before, that First John is not a very linear book. It doesn't simply logically build upon itself across a straight line. Instead, one of the, I think, best ways to think about it is it kind of has this looping structure, where as it goes from point A to point B, it doesn't do so in a straight line, but rather does it in kind of this spiraling pattern, where it'll move forward and then it will pick up extra, and it'll move forward and then it'll sort of double back and pick up some more, and pick up some more, and pick up some more. So today, as we get started, I wanted us to actually begin at the end of our passage. If you were part of us last week, if you watched us last week, you know that in the beginning of chapter 3, we focused on 1 John 3, 1 through 3, which is where the author assures us, back to this theme of reassurance, right? The author assures us that while much of our future hope in Christ is a mystery, we have the certainty of knowing that when the end comes, we will be like Christ. We don't know what all we will be like, but we know that we'll be like Christ. And here at the end of chapter 3, he offers another theme of reassurance, but instead of being a future hope or reassurance, it's a present hope and assurance. And so I want us to look at that, right? It's kind of this idea of the curlicue, right? We're picking it up here at the beginning of chapter 3, looping back, grabbing it at the end of chapter 3. And they really bookend our central theme, which is where we'll kind of camp out this morning, which is around 3:11 through 16 or so. But what's happening here is really important, as it will color our understanding of where we go there. So if you've got a copy of Scripture, let me read for us the end of our passage, and then we'll come back and read the whole thing here in a minute. All right? Sound good? So this is 1 John 3, 21 through 24. Take us through the end of the chapter. And it says, "Dear friends, if we don't feel guilty, we can come to God with bold confidence, and we will receive from him whatever we ask, because we obey him and do the things that please him. And this is his commandment. We must believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. Those who obey God's commandment remain in fellowship with him, and he with them. And we know he lives in us because the Spirit he gave us lives in us." So here, they're sort of wrestling with, again, this uncertainty of faithfulness. We'll pick it up. We'll kind of see this as we read it all the way through, that we have this guilt, we have this uncertainty, we have this just anxiety of, are we doing the right thing? Are we being faithful in the right way? What can we know? So the author has given us this assurance that our faith will lead us to both a mysterious and a certain future. And here now he's saying that in verse 22 in particular, we'll receive from him whatever we ask because we obey him and do the things that pleases him. So the pastor, the elder here, has this great kind of almost overwhelming confidence both in our future and our present. Well, where does that come from? Well, remember, here in 1 John, this is kind of part of the Johannine community, as best we can tell, a group of early believers who were aware of the Gospel of John and then all the letters of John, that this was a part of their tradition. So while sometimes we need to be careful about not jumping around from book to book to book to book, assuming that the early New Testament audience or authors all knew what was going on, that's sometimes the case, but we've got to be careful there. When it comes to the letters and the Gospel of John, we have even more confidence, though, that this was really likely part of the same community, the same tradition, the same sort of beliefs and understanding, that we can make those connections between the gospel and the letters with a little more certainty or a little more readiness. So keep your finger here in 1 John 3, and let's shift to John's Gospel, chapter 15. We'll be going back and forth this morning so you can have a bookmark in both places, okay? So let me read for us John 15, 5 through 8. We'll pick up another chunk of this section here in a minute when we shift our topic. But here's what Jesus himself is saying to his disciples in John 15, 5 through 8, all right? He says, "Yes, I am the vine, and you are the branches. Those who remain in me, and I in them, will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. But if you remain in me, and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want, and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great glory to my Father." Now, let's just touch base real quick on this idea of bearing fruit, right? This is important in John's Gospel and John's letters, right? That our actions, our fruit of our faith is significant and worth paying attention to. So we see that here from Jesus himself in John's Gospel, as well as already in 1 John. And we'll actually touch on this a little bit here when we go back and read the rest of our section here this morning. But what Jesus is beginning to say is, okay, if you remain in me, not only will you bear fruit, not only will you be connected to the vine, but that you'll be able to ask for things and receive them with confidence, right? Well, what does he mean by that? Surely he doesn't mean that just because we become people of faith, just because we've made a decision to make Jesus the Lord of our life, that anything and everything we ask for will happen. I don't think that's what Jesus means. I don't think he's saying, congratulations, you've got access to the Jesus vending machine, whatever you need, whatever you want will come to be, right? Well, so if he doesn't mean that, then what does he mean? Well, I think what he means actually looks a little bit like dogs. Let me tell you what I mean. So dogs and owners, whether you've realized it or not, whether we admit it or not, they look a little bit alike, right? You know what I'm talking about? How over time, dogs and owners begin to look more and more like each other. It's almost as if the dog and the owner both transform and move closer and closer together. Here's a few examples of what I'm talking about. I think you know what I mean. But here's some great examples, right? We'll show those to you. And in fact, if you can believe it or not, about 5 or 6 years ago, a team of psychologists in Japan began scientifically studying how this happens. And they found that there's some pretty compelling data over time that as we live in close proximity, people and dogs, we do begin to kind of take on some of the characteristics or traits of one another, right? Well, I think part of what's happening here is a deeper truth on a spiritual level. That Jesus is saying, if you remain in me, then you will begin to be transformed to be like me. That just as an owner or a dog, as they remain together, here literally in the Greek, the word for remain is also the same word for abide. And so what Jesus is saying, if you abide with me, if you live with me, if you take up residence with me and within me, then you'll begin to be transformed. And it's much the same way, right? As dogs and humans live together, they begin to be transformed, to look more like each other. And so I think part of what's happening here is Jesus is saying, the author of 1 John is saying, look, there's confidence here. We know that you'll begin to receive what you ask for. Why? Because the more that you abide with Jesus, the more that you're connected to the vine, the more that we are transformed to be like Jesus. All of a sudden, our needs are transformed. Our dreams are transformed. Our hopes are transformed. Our priorities, our desires, our resources are transformed to become more like Christ. And so it makes sense, right? That the more we become like Christ, the more we desire the same things as Christ, the more we work towards the same ends as Christ. And so we have greater and greater confidence that what we desire becomes what also God is desiring. And so we have more and more confidence that that can come to pass. Not simply because Jesus is just kind of open for business, right? If you remember that scene from Bruce Almighty when Bruce gets his powers, his godlike powers, right, in this experiment from God, and he just says yes to everyone's request. It's chaos, right? Well, that's not what we're talking about here. But rather he says, okay, if you abide with me, if you live with me, you'll begin to be transformed. And what you desire, what you dream about, what you hope for, will also be transformed. It will become more and more the desires of God's heart, and we have more and more confidence in seeing those desires come about in the world. Pretty cool, right? Well, so if you're sitting here saying, okay, well, this is kind of interesting, maybe I'm on board with this, well, what does he mean? How do we remain with God? How do we abide with God? That's the question, right? Well, good news, that's what the heart of our passage here in 1 John 3 is about, and what a good chunk of the rest of John 15 is about, all right? So let's go back, 1 John 3:11. I'll read us the whole passage, and we'll pick up the main theme of this shift in John about what does it take for us to abide with Christ? Love. It's us abiding in God's love and with God's love. That's what transforms us from the inside out. Let's take a look. This is the message you've heard from the beginning. We should love one another. We must not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and killed his brother. And why did he kill him? Because Cain had been doing what was evil, and his brother had been doing what was righteous. So don't be surprised, dear brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. If we love our brothers and sisters who are believers, it proves that we have passed from death to life. But a person who has no love is still dead. Anyone who hates another brother or sister is really a murderer at heart. And you know that murderers don't have eternal life within them. We know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need, but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let us show the truth by our actions. Our actions will show that we belong to the truth. So we will be confident when we stand before God. Even if we feel guilty, God is greater than our feelings and he knows everything. Dear friends, if we don't feel guilty, we can come to God with bold confidence. And we will receive from him whatever we ask because we obey him and do the things that please him. And this is his commandment. We must believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us. Those who obey God's commandments remain in fellowship with him, and he with them. And we know he lives in us because the Spirit he gave us lives in us. So this begins, as we talked about earlier, the section in 1 John really exploring God's love. We come to some of the most memorable moments in 1 John. We'll get to here in the next couple weeks, 1 John 4:18, right? That God is love, this great declarative, insightful moment that God isn't just the creator of love. God isn't someone who loves love, but God is love. God's very being is love. We see that it's central both to our understanding of Christ and also our understanding of ourselves. I was really struck, I don't know about you, but this idea of the connection between love and life and hatred or evil and death, right? And it goes two ways. It kind of goes both ways, right? So take a quick look here. He says in verse 14, right, that love, it proves that we have passed from death to life, but a person who has no love is still dead. Anyone who hates another brother or sister is really a murderer at heart, and you know that murderers don't have eternal life within them. This is an echo of Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount, right? Anyone who hates a brother, right, is committing murder in his heart. But this idea is really interesting to me, right? But that a person who has no love is still dead. Or that, to pick up another phrase, a person who has no love is still in darkness. Or as we might say at King's Cross, they're still broken. that the consequence of the absence of love, right, the consequence of hate or evilness or division or brokenness, the consequence of that is darkness and death. And then the consequence, though, of transitioning, of moving into love, is to move into light. It's to move into life. And so these are massive truths, but also massive ways of being in the world. Critical in 1 John's mind of how we are meant to be faithful to God, to one another, but also in a sense of how God has been faithful to us, because that he has loved us, right? And so here in just a minute, we'll pick up kind of this idea. Well, what does he mean here at the very beginning in verse 11 of this commandment that we've heard from the beginning, right? This is an echo of chapter 1, verse 5, as well as the early verses in chapter 3, that we have heard this both from the beginning and from Jesus, that we should love one another. But again, in his kind of curlicue spiral pattern, we go from this idea early in chapter 3 that we don't know what the future holds. We don't know when the end of things comes, what all we will be like, but we know we'll be like Christ. And what is Christ like? Well, Christ is like love. And so he commands us now in the present to be people of love, to be living lives of love. Why? Well, because he is moving us, he's moving with us to that distant horizon point of Christ likeness. And that it's in love and through love that we transform ourselves, we are transformed by God, and we transform the world around us. And so in our passage this morning, he moves us through, okay, don't be like Cain, right, who chose hate, who chose jealousy, who chose envy of his brother Abel, the early chapters of Genesis, but instead choose to be like Christ, choose to be people of love and of light. And then he begins to move us through. He says, remember, your actions matter. Your actions of love matter. They're in the middle section here. And then we get to that place where we started this morning, which is the end. We get to this place of reassurance and confidence. That as we become transformed, as we seek to love people, then we move towards that horizon point. We move closer to Christ-likeness. And in doing that, we have great hope in both the present and the future. All right, some big ideas, right? Well, let's shift back real quickly to John's gospel. Let's read the rest of this section in chapter 15, right, that we started earlier, the vine and the branches. All right, so turn with me, John 15, and let me read for us. We'll pick up in verse 9, and we'll just go ahead and read through that section in verse 17, right? Well, this is what Jesus, again, speaking to the disciples, moving towards the end, moving towards the cross. This is what he has to say. He says, I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. So remain in my love, right? He says, remain in me a few verses earlier, right? Abide in me. Now he says, remain in my love. Live, abide in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love. Just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love, I have told you these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I have loved you. There's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you slaves because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. You are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit. Right? There's fruit again, right? Actions, the fruit of our faith. So that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. This is my commandment. Love each other. All right, let's see here for just a minute. Let's kind of unpack this, right? Jesus does some really beautiful things here in this movement that we begin to understand. He says, first of all, you've become my friends, right? And I want you, as my friends, to know everything that I know. I've shared with you all that the Father shared with me. And so remain in me, bear fruit connected to me as the vine, right? And then do that by remaining in my love. Bear the fruit of love in the world. He says there's no greater act of love, there's no greater connection to the source of love than to lay down your life for your friend. Well, of course, that's exactly what Jesus did for us, literally laying down his life for his friends, for us, so that we may in turn experience love and life. Well, I don't think what Jesus is saying is that we all need to go out and literally lay down our lives, right? To go find the nearest cross and do something Christ-like in that way. But what he's saying is that the fullest expression of love, the purest, the deepest, the most central expression of love is to love the way Jesus loved us. Remember, we've talked about this earlier in 1 John, the author, the pastor in 1 John is so concerned that we hold on to the incarnation, that we hold on to the belief that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. Why? Because he is both an example to us as a full person, right? Living out the love of God. But that also, it means that what Jesus has done can impact us directly, right? That with Jesus, through Jesus, in Jesus, we can have a hope of loving somehow, some way, like Jesus. Well, how is Jesus loved, right? Well, think about the cross. Think about the ultimate act of love, his laying down his life for us. It's several things, right? It's a gift that's freely given without expectation or exchange, right? It's a gift that we didn't earn or deserve. It's a gift of love that came at a great cost to Jesus, both pain and separation from the Father. And it's a gift that's born to us generously, right? It's an extravagant gift. That's what it means to lay our life down for our friends, right? That's the kind of life, that's the kind of action that Jesus is calling to. And here in 1 John, that's exactly the kind of pattern, that's exactly the kind of community that he's seeking to hold. He says, well, this is what it means to be faithful. It's for us to love each other, for us to take care of each other, for us to love one another the way that Christ loved us. It's a big deal, right? And that's borne out not just in an emotion of love, not just in the idea of love, of the words of love. The words of love matter, but in the actions of love, right? To throw back all the way to DC Talk, right? Christian music in the 90s, right? Love is a verb. That's a little bit of what 1 John is getting us at. But before we sort of jump off into the deep end of loving each other, right, of sacrificially caring for one another, there's one last important point that we've got to hold on to, right? So jump back with me one more time to 1 John 3, and we'll kind of begin to wrap up here at this connection point, right? So here towards the end of 1 John 3, it's easy to miss, but the author, the elder here, sums this up so powerfully. And he says, let's look at verse 23. He says, and this is his commandment. We must believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us. Those who obey God's commandments remain in fellowship with him, and he with them. And we know he lives in us because the Spirit he gave us lives in us. This is critical. It's so easy to miss. But the elder here is so wise. He's saying, okay, before you can love, you have to stay connected to Jesus. That our hope to love like Jesus, the only way that we, broken, dark people who live in death, right? People who live in the darkness, people who live in death, people who live in brokenness, the only way we can hope to love like Jesus, the only way that we can hope to remain in him, the only way that we can hope to be transformed by him is if we first connect to Jesus, if we first have that core of belief, and then we have that core relationship, and then we turn to Jesus as our help in order to become people of love. He says you can't just go out there and decide to love and all this will happen, but rather you have to remain in him. The branches have to be connected to the vine, and once that happens, once that connection is established, once that connection is cultivated, maintained, well then the nutrients, right? The power, the fruit becomes possible throughout the extent of the branches. So he says, you first must believe in Jesus and then love one another just as he commanded us. So here's my encouragement, right? Here's my challenge for you. If you don't know who this Jesus is, if you don't know what it means to remain in him, to live with him, to believe in Jesus as the Lord and Savior of your life, reach out to me. Drop me a message here on YouTube, on Facebook. Go to our website, drop me an email. I'd love to start that conversation with you about how do we connect to Jesus, but then this idea of how do we remain, right? Are we talking to Jesus daily? Are we in God's scriptures daily? Are we in community and conversation pursuing Christ's likeness, pursuing this transformation daily? That's what's going to give us the inner strength, right? That's what's going to give us the grounding, the rootedness to live this life of love. And once that's in place, though, it's not enough, right? 1 John would say, or Jesus would say, it's not just enough to be connected to me, but you should be bearing fruit. You should be loving others in your midst. You should be loving sacrificially. You should be loving like me. So here's my challenge for you this week, a challenge I'll be doing as well, that we reach out and look for one way, once a day, to lay down our life for those that we come into contact with. These could be ways both large or small. These could be a major sacrifice, right? It could be of our time, of our finances, or it could be something small. Maybe it's you coming home, you and your spouse, at the end of a long, stressful day, in the midst of this long, stressful time, and one of you wants to watch one show and one of you wants to watch the other. One of you wants this for dinner and one of you wants that for dinner. What does it look like for you to lay down your preference? What does it look like for you without expectation, without turning it into a transaction, a this for that? What does it look like for you to just lay down your life, to lay down your desire, your preference, your needs in that moment for someone else? You do it for a spouse, for a child, for a parent, for a coworker. But he says when you encounter those in need, whatever that need is, that's where the opportunity comes from, right? Just like Christ encountered us in the midst of our great need, our great brokenness, laid down his life for us in the most extravagant, grace-filled way possible. That's what the gospel's all about, and that's what it means to be the people of God today. We're in the midst of this crazy time. There's no shortage of ways for us to love people. There's no shortage for needs. So my prayer for you and for me is that we have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts willing and able to lay down our life for one another. Let's stay connected both to God and to each other in this time. Know that I'm praying for you, that I love you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you very, very soon. Let's continue in worship.